Repugnant Markets and the Right to Transact. Here to discuss the sensitive issue around crypto markets that are thought to be illegal or pertaining to transactions that some people don't want to be involved in or exposed to, please welcome Leah Callon Butler.
Hello everybody. Thank you very much to my Aussie cheer crew down here. Really appreciate that. I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. Last year I was just an attendee, and this year I'm doing a keynote. So it really is pretty incredible to be here, and I'd say if anyone out there really wishes that they could do it too, dream big. So I'm going to talk today about repugnant markets and the right to transact. And I wanted to start out by showing you some really interesting pictures. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Pac-Man. This is a 1980s propaganda advertisement warning of the threats of video games. Now, back then, there was a lot of information that was going out warning people of the dangers of video games, particularly to young people. The idea was that it was a threat to young people's health and well-being, potentially their mental health. The idea that they're out playing these games that are search, kill, destroy. And that perhaps video games were going to be taking our youth away from better endeavors, say studying at the library. It's very interesting, actually, because I was just having a chat just before with someone in the audience about how we've embraced video games today. And we might even say that they're quite social games where you can interact with international networks, you can certainly learn critical skills like strategic thinking. And for some, it's also our first interaction with technology, which can actually bear to it a whole life in a fascination with technology. Certainly, I know a lot of people in the blockchain and crypto space started out playing video games when they were younger, and it spurred that lifelong love. But here you can see, back in the 1980s, the story was very, very different. So today I want you to think about repugnant markets. And by repugnancy, I mean certain types of transactions that we have a particular distaste for. And that might change depending on where you are in the world and the certain social attitudes that are associated with that market. But also have a think about how that might change over time. Bit of a disclaimer, I'm not here to offend anyone, but if we can perhaps just put our certain personal ideas aside just for the duration of the talk and have a think about how some of our morals might get in the way of a more objective lens. That's my Twitter handle. So if you want to find me and tweet away, please do. I'm the same on Telegram too if you want to reach out. So repugnant markets, I'm just going to take you through a few of them so that you can get an idea about what I mean. First is adult. So the adult industry is highly stigmatized. There's a lot of shame associated with it. It's still something that we really struggle to talk about in mainstream markets. So for example, when people are thinking about the adult industry, our mind immediately goes to things like pornography, perhaps escorting. One thing that I just want to clarify that in this talk, I will be only talking about markets that are completely legal, legitimate, and tax-paying. So when I mention escorting, I mean only in jurisdictions where it's legal or decriminalised, such as Australia, and the UK. But even so, even where these products and services are completely legal, and businesses are providing them and paying tax where it's due, often they are restricted from using certain B2B services or say advertising their services due to moral guidelines. So the adult industry is definitely a victim of this. I just want to point out too that the breadth and scope of this is actually huge. It's not just, say, porn and escorting, it's also things like women's sexual health products, reproductive services, also things like novelties, so sex toys around the world. They all have exactly the same problems around stigma and shame that potentially stunts and holds these industries back. An interesting one and a topical one now is cannabis. So it feels like almost overnight it's gone from an illegal industry to completely recreational in many states in the US. But this leaves the market in a very interesting state because they still have a lot of problems with basic payment processing, for example, where it might be, so to give you an example, a pot shop in California might have struggles getting banked or accessing basic payment processing because, as we've seen it come recreational, it's not only just a state-based agenda where a lot of the banking services are actually federal. It will actually prevent them from being able to access those services because it's still seen as illegal on a federal stage. Again, too, it's moral stigma that comes into it and holds a lot of these markets back. Gambling is another one. It's an adult activity which is completely legal in many places across the world, but often seen as, say, a bad or immoral activity for people to be involved in. Nootropics, if you've heard of them, they're often completely legal and exempt from being a controlled substance in many states or jurisdictions across the world. But again, they're seen as potentially immoral. Sometimes just the fact that they're listed in a legal document, even if it's because they are exempt, that's enough to say scare off a bank to say, well, actually, we're not going to bank this business. Here's an interesting one. I'm looking into the future a bit here. In Australia, on the 19th of June in Victoria, voluntary assisted dying becomes legal. Now, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of people who will be in some way opposed to this because of religious reasoning. Now, think about how this market could or could not develop because there's certain moral stigma that will be holding it back. Another one, certainly, is abortion. Now, what about not so repugnant markets? So by this I mean markets that have been repugnant in the past and now we think nothing of it. I already mentioned video games. Another one is alcohol. Over time, alcohol has been prohibited in many jurisdictions. Today we really think nothing of it. I'm certainly looking forward to a beer at the end of this. Now this is one that I like to call the 50 Shades effect. So kink and fetish wear, and also the sorts of sex toys and things that go with it. This particular market has recently completely opened up because of material like 50 Shades of Grey that has spoken to completely unserved and undervalued market segments that were previously not recognised by, say, the adult industry. Now, I can show you a picture like this, and we really don't think that much of it. But it hasn't always been that way. Another very interesting one is the UFC. Now, in 2001, the UFC was banned across 50 states in the US, and you couldn't watch it on TV. There was a VC office in the US that took a chance on a fledgling MMA firm. They put $2 million in. Fast forward 15 years, the UFC is one of the fastest growing competitive sports in the world, and it was purchased for $4 billion. So have a think about how our social attitudes to these types of products and services can change over time. Moral arbitration. So what do I mean by this? This is where we're looking at these types of markets and deciding that based on our personal viewpoint, our experience, where we come from in the world, that they're somehow obscene and or immoral, and they should be regulated and potentially stunted, really, in terms of their industry growth, because those services and products are not right for the people within our jurisdiction. Now, I really love this quote. It's from Kate Carnell. She's the small business ombudsman for Australia. And she's always had a bit of a thing about this. She says that it's a bit rich, don't you think? Of everyone out there to decide what's moral, the banks are deciding who can and can't access these basic B2B services. So she's been quite a crusader for this. There was actually a story in Australia, a business in Canberra called the Pleasure Box, which sells sex toys and lingerie and things like that. They applied to use a particular service called Afterpay. So it's a bit like, you can buy it today and then pay off your sale over the next few weeks. Afterpay rejected the Pleasure Box from using their services on the grounds that it was immoral and obscene products that they couldn't serve. Kate Carnell actually got onto this and said, well, this is actually extortion. And usually it's overlooked. Just because it's adult, it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be serving them. But keep in mind, there is nothing illegal about what this business is doing. It's purely someone's viewpoint that is preventing them from using a service that all their competitors in the same e-commerce sector are able to use. So they're giving unfair competitive advantage to that business's competitors. Anyway, they won, and now they use Afterpay on their site. So any kind of business that's in this space, they're pretty used to the after effects of what's happening around repugnancy. The main one is refusal of service, like I just explained with the pleasure box. They were not able to use Afterpay's services because someone deemed what they were doing as morally wrong. Similarly so, if you're a sex worker in Sydney in Australia, where the service is decriminalised, you will still have trouble opening a bank account. Payment processors won't deal with you, PayPal, Stripe, Square, on the basis of moral grounds. Now, if you do, it's just while you're thinking about you being a sex worker in Sydney, let's say you do go into the bank and you lie to them about what you do. Oh, well, I'm a massage therapist. If at any time they become suspicious about what you actually do, they'll freeze your account and they'll take your money, usually with some kind of excuse around, oh, well, we had to do an investigation into where your funds were coming from. So you'll probably not see that money come back. The next piece is exorbitant fees. So I've already mentioned the mainstream payment processors, but these other guys I've got here, CCBill, Paxum, SegPay, Epoch is another one. They're payment processors who look after high-risk industries and clients. So they're absolutely fantastic businesses because they actually give these repugnant markets a way to be able to transact, which is safe and secure. But it is expensive. It's very expensive. If you are an established business in adult and you've been around for a long time, you've got a good reputation, you might pay, say, 5 to 6% on your credit card transactions. Now, that's for the well-established businesses. If you're a newbie coming into the industry, you can expect to pay anywhere between 18 to 22%, I've seen. Now, this completely goes under the radar because no one really cares. Oh, well, it's adult, why should we be fighting for them? Chargebacks is something else that I would say is real and perceived risk for these markets. Basically, what a chargeback is someone buys a product and then later they have some remorse. Maybe someone's seen it come up on their credit card and they're like, oh, what's that? Or maybe they just feel guilty that they bought it at all. And they'll ring up the bank and ask for the transaction to be reversed. Now, as a merchant, I'd kind of assumed that you'd be thinking like, wow, this is really bullshit because you bought a product off me, I delivered it, why should the bank reverse that transaction? It's really interesting when you speak to the merchants. Because they've already got such a shaky relationship with the banks, most of the time they'd actually be really happy to give the consumer a complete refund. They just don't want them to call to the banks and complain. Because you get enough complaints in a month, and then suddenly they freeze your account, or they put up your transaction fees, and so on. And also access to funding is another huge problem in this space. You can imagine for all the reasons that I've mentioned, it's very, very difficult to get funding. This is just a blog from Stripe Payments. They really wanted to work with OMG Yes, which is one of the first services in the world to look at the female orgasm. Sorry, I've just realized I'm out of time. They look at women's pleasure from a research-based approach, and it's one of the first times that this has ever been done in the world. But they weren't actually able to work with Oh My God Yes, despite the fact that they thought they were an excellent social impact project because they're governed by the same rules from Visa and MasterCard that's handed down on everybody, and they had to reject them because there's this explicit content on the website. It's not just financial. You'll find that all of these businesses, they can't advertise their services on social media. That picture there is actually a pile of 45 women's pleasure massages that was confiscated from me when I was going through a Philippines airport. I was charged with bringing obscene and immoral goods into the Philippines. They were taken off me. I'm just going to skip through this a little bit because I have gone over time. But this is a huge missed opportunity. If we can put aside our morals and actually start to look at changing attitudes and how we could actually potentially help people who are operating in these markets and deliver ethical goods to ethical consumers, there's a huge opportunity here and a lot of money to potentially be made. Also, tech adoption. The adult industry, for one, has been at the forefront of driving tech adoption right from the beginning. You can probably thank porn for the internet the way it is today. But really, for me, this comes back to the question of the right to transact. It's about financial inclusion. If people are expelled from certain economic markets because of someone else's ideals, this is probably the most un-blockchain thing I can possibly think of. And you're probably thinking, why are you bringing up this use case now? Everybody knows that this can already be sorted with crypto. Well, actually, it can't. So quite infamously, Bitpay, in February 2018, revoked services to a bunch of high-risk markets, including adult, gambling, and I can't remember the other one. But Bitpay processes, anyone who had their API installed on their site that was an adult website wasn't able to use their products anymore, so they had to go and find another crypto payment processor. Coinbase too also won't work with most of these businesses. So anyway, in short, I think that this is an excellent use case for blockchain. And really, I think we all need to be thinking about this as we move forward. When we think about decentralization, what kind of products are we building and from whom? And are our morals getting in the way? Thank you very much.